Christians who are loved and accepted by God experience all these things. It has really nothing to do with God's love. God is for you. Paul himself experienced all these things that he lists here in this verse. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, if you're taking notes, listen to this list. It's a well-known list. You probably are familiar with it. This list of the things that Paul suffered as a minister of Jesus Christ, as he's serving the Lord. He says this is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, he says, speaking of his service to the Lord, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, being whipped. Paul says, I was whipped more than anyone. In stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently. Paul was put in prison for preaching the gospel. In deaths often. Paul faced death at times. But that doesn't mean that God was against him. God was still for him. He says in verse 24, from the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. He was whipped 5 different times. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I wouldn't get on a ship with Paul. A night and a day I've been in the deep. He says 3 times I was shipwrecked, and I spent a night and a day floating in the Mediterranean Sea, like clinging to an igloo cooler kind of thing. In journeys often, in perils of water. Perils is one of our words in our list in verse 35. In perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger. Right? That's in the list in verse 35. In thirst, in fastings often, in cold. There were times when Paul was just cold as he was serving the Lord. Just cold. I remember when we first moved here 20 plus years ago. We moved here from Florida. Remember the first winter here, I was freezing all the time. And I remember a guy in the church, I was saying, man, it is cold here all the time. I'm freezing. And he said, well, you don't have the right coat. I said, what do you mean? He said, that's a Florida coat. I was like, well, this was like the heaviest coat you could buy in Florida. He said, you need a winter coat. Paul was just cold for Jesus. And nakedness, he says. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily. That's not even the daily stuff that he's dealing with all the time. My deep concern for all the churches. His burden that he has all the time for the different churches that they're doing okay. Paul knows from personal experience that none of these things can separate us from the love of Christ. None of these things are a reflection on God's love. Just because you go through these things. You remember in Acts chapter 16 when Paul and Silas go to the city of Philippi on the second mission trip, and they were arrested in the city of Philippi. They were beaten with rods, and they were thrown into prison, and they were placed in stocks in the prison. And do you remember what Paul and Silas did in prison? It says at midnight, Paul and Silas began to pray and sing hymns to God. The beating and the imprisonment that Paul and Silas received were unrelated to God's love for them. It was not a reflection on God's love. They weren't in prison in like this crisis of faith. Does God love us? Or if God loves us, why would he allow something like this to happen to us? They understood that what they were experiencing, as difficult and painful as it was, it had nothing to do with God's love for them. God's love for us doesn't change. Nothing can separate us from God's love. In fact, Paul and Silas were certain that God loved them, and that's why they were singing hymns in the midst of what they were experiencing. The love of God for them, and knowing that nothing can separate them from the love of God. The love of God is what carried them through that terrible experience. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, including tribulations we might go through, trials, troubles, distressing situations we might go through, persecution we might face, famine, a lack of resources, nakedness, being destitute, different types of peril we might face, or even the sword. None of that can separate us from the love of Christ. The love of Christ is the one constant in our life. That's the one thing that we can count on. That's never going to change. There's no shadow of turning with God. Everything else around us can change. Everything else around us can change in a moment and disappear in a moment. You look at what has happened in North Carolina and Tennessee with that hurricane that came, and whole towns are gone overnight. Everything in life can be swept away in a moment, but not the love of God for you. That's the one thing that never changes. And that's the one thing that you can be certain will never change. And nothing that happens to you separates you from the love of Christ. That's the one thing that you can count on always in your life.